crime against humanity committed against prisoners since the Bataan death marches in the Philippines of American and Australian servicemen by the Japanese at the end of the war. Those Japanese who ordered that barbaric treatment to march prisoners to death were executed in the Tokyo trials. There was a similar situation, of course, in Srebrenica, when 7,000 Muslim men and boys were executed by the Serbs. They were imprisoned, but only for a few hours. This was a crime against people who'd been kept in prison for 7 or 8 years, and in many cases were Melikesh, had served their sentence. This was a brutal execution without a trial, without an appeal, without mercy. Now, that was what happened on the 29th of July. The bodies were put in large refrigerated vans. They were taken off to secret places, sometimes the parts of cemeteries which were the parts of the damned, those who'd been convicted and hanged normally in the normal course of justice. But these were mass graves. 29 of them have been uncovered. 29 mass graves dating from this period of 1988. And what can we say? What was the reaction? Those who knew, and by this I mean not only the Ayatollah, but the man who was president, he was the supreme leader, but the president of Iran at that time was the man who is now the supreme leader, a mass murderer who leads Iran. The commander of the army, who was in it up to his ears, was Rafsanjani. He died recently. But the minister of justice today is Ephraim Raisi, the member of the death committee who was so determined to follow the Ayatollah's orders and pass death sentences on innocent people in today's Iran. Not only have they not been punished, these people, these scoundrels who committed mass murder, are elevated to the most important positions in modern Iran. So how can that be? How is it that when every other crime committed in this world since the Second World War has had some prosecution, some retribution, this has not had any? And the relatives, the families of those who were killed in this barbaric way have not been allowed to mourn. They've not been told the location of the mass graves in which their children rot. They've not been told given any reason. Sometimes they were given a plastic bag. If they turned up at the prison a few months later, they were given a plastic bag with the poor possessions of their children. And they can't mourn. A few of these places have been uncovered by rumor, by digging in places and finding moldy old prison blankets in the grave. But they're not allowed. So they turn up regularly every September and August to pay tribute to their children, and they're cleared away by the police. So this is the barbarousness that still continues without any sort of retribution. Of course, there was some resistance. Indeed, there was a very fine imam who was number 2. He was slated to be the Ayatollah who would succeed Ayatollah Khomeini, And he lost his position and ended up under house arrest because he objected to what was happening. He called the death committee in and said, "You've killed 3,000 people in the first few days at Evan Prison. Don't you realize what this is going to mean, how this is going to go down in history? Don't you realize that we are breaching the Geneva Conventions and this convention and that convention? Stop it immediately." Stop it they did until he lost his power and he was put under house arrest and he was removed from the succession to Ayatollah Khomeini and replaced by the man who is now the supreme leader, the lickspittle, who did the wicked orders, passed them on along with Rafsanjani, and had the death committee implement them. So what to do? Why wasn't the world, why didn't the United Nations do something about this? I think one reason is that although Amnesty International heard of what was happening, it didn't resound, it didn't make much importance, because what the world wanted was a truce in the war between Iran and Iraq, and that was one reason why they were disinclined at the UN to take any notice. The other reason was that the United Nations had a special rapporteur for Iran. He was a rather naive academic, Professor Pohl, and he allowed himself to be misled by the Iranian government, who denied the reports. And later they allowed him into Evan Prison, and they welcomed him with a brass band and with a group of so-called prisoners. I believe they were actors who told him how superb the food was. So the United Nations had a man investigating who was extremely naive. And so Iran was never taken to task until more recently over this massive crime against humanity. And I must say, it went on after it stopped initially because Montazeri was able to stop it for a few weeks. It continued, and not only were the people who were supporting the MEK, not only were they executed, but the move was made against the atheists, against the socialists, against the communists. All those were called up, and they were asked, not to what organization are you affiliated, they were asked one of a series of questions. Would you fight against, would you execute a fellow prisoner? Would you walk through a minefield for your country? Would you kill a member of your group? And so on and so forth. And if they showed any reluctance, they were, if they were male, taken out and strung up. If they were women, there was a different rule applied. If you were a woman atheist, you were beaten 5 times a day, 5 times a day, until you either died from the beating, which a number did, or gave in and agreed to pray in the way the government wanted you to pray. This was, at every level, an exercise of massive cruelty, cruelty that ended in death, sometimes by firing squad, but usually by hanging. Massive cruelty. And that you may see in the Iranian government today, in the way it takes hostages, Nazanin Radcliffe, you may have heard, I acted for her in the early stages. She wanted to take her little baby to her grandmother in Tehran, to her mother in Tehran, and she was stopped at the airport coming back to Britain and has been there for years, got 5 years for spying, and then when Boris Johnson, as Foreign Secretary, quite recklessly and falsely said that she was out there teaching journalism, they immediately gave her another 5 years. We've just heard of that lecturer at Cambridge who's been held for a year on absurd spying charges, on a couple of Australian and British backpackers who've been arrested and held on absurd spying charges. But this is the nature of the regime. They've done very much worse. They went on to assassinate 160 people in the year 1989 to 1992, executed in Europe by an order made at the Turquoise Room, led by the supreme leader who followed after the Ayatollah had died of cancer. So that is the story, in brief, of the barbarity that this regime has imposed on those who are free thinkers, those who refuse to worship in the way that it decrees. Now, what is to be done? Iran is today, as it was yesterday, a problem for the world. And various solutions have been put up, but never a way of dealing with them for their human rights violations. We've tried to deal with them for their nuclear interests and for developing nuclear weapons, but we have not made any move on what is becoming very clear. I did the first investigation in 2010, 2011, and I interviewed about 40 people who had been in prison in Iran at the time, and I verified the facts that I'm telling you of tonight. But there have been, since, there was another investigation in 2017. Some of the people in Ashraf have been able to provide more facts. There is no doubt as to what happened, that it was mass murder and a crime against humanity. There is no doubt about who carried it out. No doubt at all. Paul Mahdi, Ephraim Raisi, and the Supreme Leader, amongst others who are in high positions today. So nothing has happened. The new special rapporteur for Iran has limited the criticism, has not, as the predecessor had done, called for any sort of further inquiry. I think it is important that either the Security Council give a direction to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to develop a case in relation to the mass killings in Iran, or it could be put these people up for trial in absentia, in their absence, because we'll never get them out of Iran while the government stands. But one way or the other, it has become crucial, I think, to the development of human rights law that some retribution, even if it's only a retribution in absentia, should be visited on these people. Set up a prosecutor, set up a court that can hear the evidence, that can shame them, can articulate what happened in those prisons in 1988, so that hopefully it will not happen again, so that the world can see what kind of people run this country. Only by telling that truth and having it widely appreciated can the other horrors that this regime is perpetrating can be called out. So that would be my plea, that this is the worst of crimes against humanity since the Second World War. Nothing has been done about it, and now the United Nations, which failed in 1988 to do anything, must step up and do something, because even by authoritatively putting out the evidence, that is one way that the truth can come out.